a Viking burial chamber in Sweden, untouched for over 1,000 years. Inside lies a warrior, surrounded by weapons, armor, and 2 horses. For decades, historians assumed this was the grave of a powerful male warrior. Then, in 2017, DNA analysis revealed something that shook the foundations of everything we thought we knew about Viking society. The Viking warrior was a woman, not just any woman, but a high-ranking military strategist who commanded armies and planned battles. This discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world, reigniting one of history's most fascinating debates. Did female Viking warriors, the legendary shield maidens, actually exist? For centuries, they've lived in our imagination. Fierce women with braided hair and battle axes, standing shoulder to shoulder with men on blood-soaked battlefields. We've seen them in television shows, heard their stories in ancient sagas, and wondered if they were more than myth. But here's where it gets interesting. The Vikings themselves left behind stories about these warrior women. Norse sagas speak of shield maidens with names that echo through time. Lagertha, Brynhildr, Hervor, women who refused to be wives and mothers, who chose the sword over the hearth, the battlefield over the home. Yet for the longest time, modern historians dismissed these tales as pure fantasy, as fictional as the dragons and giants that populate the same stories. The problem is, we've been looking at Viking history through a very specific lens. For generations, archaeology was dominated by assumptions. When researchers found a skeleton buried with weapons, they automatically labeled it male. It seemed logical, didn't it? Warriors were men. Men were warriors. This belief was so deeply ingrained that no one thought to question it. No one considered that the bones in that elaborate warrior grave might belong to someone else entirely. This wasn't just about one burial. It was about how we see the past, how we construct history based on our own cultural biases rather than evidence. Let's talk about Birka, a Viking trading center in what is now Sweden. In the 1880s, archaeologists excavated a grave known as BJ 581. What they found was extraordinary. A complete military kit, including a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, a battle knife, 2 shields, and 2 horses. Strategy game pieces were placed beside the body, suggesting this person was involved in tactical planning, not just combat. The grave screamed high-status warrior, possibly even a military commander. For over a century, this burial was featured in textbooks, museums, and academic papers as the perfect example of an elite Viking male warrior. The skeleton was even nicknamed the Warrior and displayed as proof of Viking martial culture. Then came the DNA test. When researchers finally analyzed the bones using modern genetic techniques, they discovered the skeleton was biologically female. The woman buried in grave BJ 581 was approximately 30 years old when she died, and she had been given one of the most prestigious warrior burials ever discovered from the Viking Age. The implications were staggering. If this woman was a military leader, if she commanded troops and planned battles, then everything we assumed about Viking gender roles needed to be reconsidered. But predictably, not everyone was convinced. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Critics argued that just because a woman was buried with weapons doesn't mean she used them. Perhaps they were symbolic. Perhaps she inherited them from a male relative. Perhaps she was a priestess who performed ceremonial functions. The goalposts kept moving. It's fascinating, isn't it? When a man is found with weapons, no one questions whether he actually fought. But when a woman is discovered in the exact same context, suddenly we need extraordinary proof. This double standard reveals something uncomfortable about how we approach history. We're willing to accept mythology when it confirms our biases, but we demand impossible levels of evidence when the facts challenge what we believe. Here's what makes the Birka warrior even more compelling. Her burial wasn't an isolated case. As researchers started looking more carefully, re-examining old collections and testing remains that had been sitting in storage for decades, more female warriors began to emerge. In Denmark, Norway, and across Scandinavia, graves containing women with weapons were being re-evaluated. Some had been misidentified, others had been dismissed as anomalies, but taken together, they suggested something remarkable: that women participating in warfare wasn't as rare as we'd been taught. Now, let's address the sagas, those epic tales that preserved Viking culture through oral tradition before being written down centuries later. The saga of the Volsungs tells of Brynhildr, a shield maiden who rode into battle wearing armor. The Gesta Danorum, written by the medieval chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, mentions 300 shield maidens who fought at the Battle of Bravelir. The most famous is probably Lagertha, described as a skilled warrior who fought alongside men and eventually became a ruler in her own right. For years, historians treated these stories as pure fiction, as entertaining legends with no basis in reality. But what if we've been wrong? What if these sagas, like many oral traditions, contain kernels of historical truth wrapped in mythological packaging? Think about how we treat other ancient texts. When Homer describes the walls of Troy, and archaeologists later find those walls, we don't dismiss the Iliad entirely. We recognize it as a blend of history and mythology. Yet with Viking sagas, there's been a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If the sagas mention supernatural elements, then surely everything in them must be fabricated, right? But the discovery of the Birka warrior and others like her suggests we should be more nuanced. These stories may have been embellished over time, but they might also reflect real women who lived, fought, and earned places in cultural memory. Let's dig deeper into what Viking society actually looked like. We often imagine the past as more rigid than it really was. The Vikings were seafarers, traders, and yes, raiders. They traveled from North America to the Middle East. They were exposed to dozens of different cultures, different ways of organizing society. Archaeological evidence shows Viking women owned property, ran farms, and engaged in trade. They weren't simply sitting at home waiting for men to return from voyages. When Viking men left for months or years at a time, women managed entire communities. They made economic decisions, handled disputes, and defended their homesteads. In this context, is it really so far-fetched that some women might have picked up weapons? That in a culture where survival often depended on being able to defend yourself, women would learn to fight? We have evidence of Viking women buried with keys, symbols of their authority over household and property. We have evidence of women buried with jewelry-making tools, showing their role in craft production. Why is it controversial to suggest that some women were buried with weapons because they actually used them? Here's another piece of the puzzle. Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't a monolithic culture. It was a patchwork of different communities, different traditions, different interpretations of social roles. What was true in one region might not have been true in another. It's entirely possible that in some Viking communities, women fighting was more accepted, while in others it was rare or forbidden. This regional variation is important because it means we can't make sweeping generalizations. The question isn't whether all Viking women were warriors, or whether there were vast armies of shield maidens. The question is whether some women, in some places, at some times, took up arms and fought. And increasingly, the evidence suggests the answer is yes. But let's be honest about the limitations of what we know. The archaeological record is incomplete. Most Viking burials haven't been excavated. Many that were excavated in the past were poorly documented or had remains that are now lost. DNA testing is expensive and time-consuming, so only a tiny fraction of Viking remains have been genetically analyzed. We're working with fragments, with glimpses into a world that existed over 1,000 years ago. This means we need to be humble about our conclusions, acknowledging both what the evidence suggests and what remains uncertain. What's also interesting is how this debate reflects our modern concerns about gender and power. The question of whether shield maidens existed touches on deeper anxieties about women in combat roles, about physical strength and capability, about whether there are natural or universal divisions between male and female activities. When people argue vehemently that Viking women couldn't have been warriors, they're often arguing about contemporary politics as much as ancient history. They're saying something about what they believe women can or should do today. On the other hand, there's a risk of overcorrection, of wanting so badly to find warrior women that we see them everywhere, even where the evidence is ambiguous. This is the challenge of doing history responsibly. We have to let the evidence lead us, even when it's incomplete, even when it doesn't give us the clear, satisfying answers we want. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Were there female Viking warriors? Almost certainly yes. Were they common? Probably not. Did they fight exactly like men, in exactly the same ways, in exactly the same numbers? We don't know. What we do know is this. The Vikings lived in a world where violence was common and survival often depended on being able to defend yourself. They lived in a society that was more flexible about gender roles than we've traditionally assumed. They told stories about warrior women that were passed down through generations, and they buried at least some women with the full honors of warriors, with weapons and armor and symbols of military authority. When you put all these pieces together, the picture that emerges is complex and fascinating. The Birka warrior wasn't just a warrior. She was someone who held a position of significant power and responsibility. The gaming pieces in her grave suggest she was involved in strategic planning, in the intellectual and tactical side of warfare, not just the physical act of fighting. This is crucial because it challenges another assumption, that ancient warfare was purely about brute strength and aggression. Medieval battles required coordination, strategy, logistics. A commander needed to understand terrain, supply lines, troop movements. There's no reason a woman couldn't excel at these aspects of military leadership. As more research emerges, as more graves are re-examined and more DNA tests are conducted, we're likely to discover additional examples of female warriors. Each discovery will add another piece to the puzzle, helping us understand the full spectrum of Viking society. But even now, with what we know, we can say confidently that the Shield Maidens weren't entirely mythical. They existed, not as fantasy characters, but as real women who made choices that defied the expectations we've projected onto them. So why does this matter? Why does it matter whether women fought alongside men in Viking raids and battles? It matters because history shapes how we see ourselves and our possibilities. When we tell stories about the past that erase certain people or limit them to narrow roles, we're not just being inaccurate. We're constraining our imagination about what humans are capable of. The Shield Maidens, whether we call them that or simply acknowledge them as female warriors, remind us that the past was more diverse, more surprising, and more interesting than we've been taught. The mystery of the Shield Maidens isn't completely solved. There are still questions, still debates, still discoveries waiting to be made. But we've moved beyond simply dismissing them as fantasy. We've entered a new chapter where we can examine the evidence with fresh eyes, where we can question our assumptions, where we can imagine a Viking age that included women who chose the warrior's path. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, that history is never settled, never final. It's always being rewritten as we learn more, as we dig deeper, as we are willing to challenge what we thought we knew. The Shield Maidens are no longer just legends. They're emerging from the mist of time, demanding to be seen, demanding to be remembered for who they really were.